Welcome to the Growth Series by Innovation Factory. Here we dive into the journeys of startups, entrepreneurs, and innovators, sharing their challenges, wins, and everything in between. Tune in as we hear from founders who've secured investment, scaled their businesses, and made game-changing exits. Whether you're just starting out or looking to take that next big step, we're here to inspire and guide you on your path to success. Today you're listening to...
Hi, my name is Brandon Aubie, and I am a co-founder, CTO, and president of QReserve. QReserve is a company that we started to solve a problem at universities where we had a lot of research equipment that was essentially underutilized. And so what would happen is researchers would get grants to buy equipment, and they might use it for a project, but then it would end up sitting idle or at least underutilized, despite other people wanting access to that equipment. And so the initial idea was to make a database of all the equipment available at McMaster University, actually, and make that accessible both to people at the university and outside the university. And what QReserve has grown into over the past 10 years is not only a way to share information about what's available, but also a tool to manage really complex workflows around equipment. And while QReserve started in the academic research space, the solution we've built is actually very applicable to many verticals. So anywhere people have complex workflows and calendar scheduling issues, QReserve can be a great solution for them. QReserve really got started when I was working as an employee at McMaster. So I did my PhD at McMaster, and then I got a job as a research technician. And like a lot of good companies we started QReserve not with the goal of building a company, but by solving a problem that we had ourselves. And so we had a research facility that had $20 million worth of infrastructure, equipment, personnel. And one of the ways we needed to stay sustainable was by actually working with other people, both to bring in revenue and do research projects. And so it started off with a simple, let's just build a website and show everyone what we have. But then what happened is we realized sometimes we don't have what we need. And so we would like to find it on campus. And so the story I always like to tell is one day I actually needed to find a microtome, which is a piece of equipment used for tissue analysis. And I knew our university had many of these. I knew one person who had one. I contacted them and they said theirs was broken. So where do I go next? I didn't know where to go next. And so I thought, it would be great if we could just look up who has a microtome at McMaster University. And so we started to build that there. And so it started off really just as a project in a university lab. But then we started to see potential for this growing much more. And so when my contract was up at McMaster, I decided, let's just go full steam ahead and start this as a legit incorporated company and see what we can build. So early on, when QReserve needed financing, we were fortunate enough to actually have access to different grant programs. So the first grant that was really the catalyst for me going out on my own was through McMaster for recent graduates who wanted to start a company. And so we applied for that and actually went through Innovation Factory as well to help bootstrap that, figure out what is our business model, go through the business canvas, all that really great stuff to figure out, like, do we actually have a business and a market here? And so we started to see the potential to get grants into the business, and that helped to start everything going. Over the past 10 years, we've talked to a few investors at a few times, but we've never actually raised venture capital in that way. Instead, we've really gone the route of looking for grants, and the big one is just following customer money. I am very proud to say that a lot of our money, especially today, it's revenue, and it's revenue from customers. And at the end of the day, I would much rather have $1 from a customer than $1 from an investor. And it can cause some problems because, I don't have millions of dollars sitting in the bank account that we can spend. But also having that hunger of needing to find that next dollar has, I think, been a great motivator for building a product that customers really need. The role of innovation in QReserve is really around this expectation more and more these days that computers can do a lot of the work for people in their lives. I think in the past, especially in our domain, when it comes to things like scheduling, you'd have to go through a person, especially when there's complex rules involved. So to give you an example is we work with facilities who might have a rule that says this piece of equipment can only be used 3 times a week per group. It can't be used if this other piece of equipment was used in recent times. It can't be used if the following types of samples may come in contact with it, and so on and so on. Typically, something like that requires a person to oversee it. But we can make that automated with computers and rules. And that's where QReserve is really shining, is that people will have these manual processes that are expensive to run, very error prone, and we can automate them completely so that a person can simply go to book something, and if they meet the correct criteria, they can access it. And so our philosophy with innovation in QReserve is really, what can we do to make everyone's day-to-day roles easier and make them more efficient and less prone to have errors? When QReserve was first starting, before we even called it QReserve, we were solving a problem we had in our own lab where we wanted to find collaborators to work with us, and we wanted to make it easier for ourselves to find tools we needed. And when I would talk to fellow researchers about this problem, everyone would quickly nod and say, oh, that's a great idea. I wish I had it. And that's a great idea. That doesn't mean it's a great business, because at the end of the day, for this to be a business, we need to make money. And right away, when we had this idea of maybe we can spin this out into a business, we were directed to work with Innovation Factory and start to figure out, well, what is the actual business model? Who's going to pay for it? And I think this is one of the common problems people face early on, is it's quite easy to have an idea that a lot of people like and would like to have. But it's very different from an idea that's important enough that people will pay for it. And this is a problem we experienced throughout the first several years of QReserve, where at first, before we had more of the complex workflows integrations in the system, and we were more just a sharing database, we would get a lot of positive feedback from universities with your customers saying, this sounds great. Let me know when it's bigger. But to get them to invest money into it was really hard. And so working with Innovation Factory was good for us to start to lay out, well, what is the value proposition to people? What questions should we actually ask to get past the positive comments and feedback and get into the, here is what I will pay for this type of a solution. Early on with QReserve, when we were first figuring out, is there even a business here? We went through a program at Innovation Factory to really make our value proposition, mission statement concrete. I think everything we came up with 10 or 12 years ago has completely changed by now. But in the early stages, it was really important for us to focus and to figure out, what are we actually doing, so that we had the elevator pitch. We could tell people what we're doing and not just this grand vision or these very technical ideas. And one of the really useful things we did was early on in 2015, we participated in LiONS LAIR. And QReserve was very young at the time. I was very proud to show my billboard of, I think it was 6 or 7 customers across Canada. And I thought, wow, I'm making it here. But what LiONS LAIR did was it forced us to come up with a very clear, articulate pitch of what we were doing, and also respond to hard questions from people who don't necessarily care directly about the problem you were solving. Because like I was saying before, it's very easy to get someone who has the same pain say, yes, that sounds like a great idea. But then you talk to someone who's more involved in the business community and they say, well, who's going to pay for that? And going through LiONS LAIR, just the experience of learning how to have public speaking, learning how to say exactly what we're doing and why it's important to everyone was a huge learning experience. Innovation Factory has been providing us with a ton of very valuable resources. Early on, we had access to mentors who were just really good at asking us hard questions, like, why are we doing this? What's the point of that? What's the value in that? And it just makes you think a lot about why you're making certain decisions. I'd say from a financial perspective, the grants and opportunities that we got connected to through Innovation Factory were also extremely useful. So for example, we've applied to grants that have afforded us the chance to go overseas, to the UK, or down to California for a week. We've also had access to funding that's allowed us to hire new employees and grow our team, and also have direct introductions to really important funders like OCE and IRAP, who have been really core to us growing the business. More recently, we've had the chance to participate in the Healthy program, where we're getting essentially unbiased and unfettered access to people at St. Joe's to give us feedback on the direction that we're taking QReserve in. With QReserve, as we've been building it, a lot of the decisions we make are directly around what customers need, but it's always going to have some bias because maybe they've already decided to purchase us, maybe we're trying to sell to them. But with Healthy, we're working with researchers at St. Joe's. They don't have a reason to be nice to us or to lie to us. Essentially, the program is letting them give their completely unbiased feedback and allow us to build a better product for not just St. Joe's, but other similar hospitals and research institutions like them. The pandemic was a really interesting time for QReserve because all of our customers were essentially people working from research institutions or offices. And so when everyone went home, the usage of QReserve dropped to pretty much zero for a couple of months. And to be honest, during that time, it was a little nerve-wracking, but I wasn't super worried because I knew people would eventually come back to work. And actually, the return to work made a huge opportunity for us because people who didn't need scheduling before suddenly had a use case for it. So for example, a small lab with only, let's say, a dozen researchers and a few pieces of equipment, they might not have had a need to schedule access to that room. They could just work it out amongst themselves. But now they would have a capacity limit of 2. And so people would need to book their time the night before they accessed it. Or maybe we had different rules in place where you could only have a certain amount of time there, or people might have to fill out a survey first, for example, about their current health condition. And we just tried to embrace that as much as we could and start marketing that we have solutions for that. And what we found was that a lot of customers who didn't need us before suddenly did, and those who were using us before needed us more. Now, I was a little afraid during this time that these return to work customers would just disappear once the pandemic was over. That happened for a few customers, but what actually happened for most people is they realized the utility of something like QReserve outside of simple pandemic return to work requirements. And they ended up embracing QReserve even after those restrictions were lifted and using us more and more. So yes, absolutely, the pandemic was an interesting time for QReserve. We also went to a fully remote working situation. We used to have an office at MIP, but then everyone went remote. And so we learned a lot about how to work remote effectively during that time, which we still do today. But yeah, I think ultimately it gave us a really good opportunity to expand the solution and think outside the box for different use cases that we still employ today. Since QReserve was founded in 2014, so we're now just over 10 years old, we've gone through a lot of transformations. When we first started, because we haven't actually raised huge investment, for a lot of the first few years, it was very, I'd say, more ad hoc. So I know personally, I spent some time working as a research professor at Mohawk College, actually, and QReserve was more part-time. But as we grew the product, grew the technology, grew our customer base, we were able to grow the team as well. And QReserve has really become a larger company. We now employ 8 full-time people, and we've really matured as a company. So this past year actually has been a huge, I'll say, maturing opportunity for QReserve, where because we grew so quickly in the past 3 years, we've had to implement new processes and ways to run the business. When you have 5 or 6 customers, it's a lot easier than when you have 150 customers, for example. Chasing people to pay you, figuring out who this person last talked to, a lot of these things become more complex. And so for the past year, we've been building processes and procedures to make these all run more efficiently. We've also in the past year obtained our SOC 2 accreditation, which just means that we're running our business in a secure and proper fashion that a lot of customers like to see. And we've also grown the team quite a bit. So I said we're 8 people now. We were 3 people just about a year and a half ago. And that comes with a lot of growing pains and learning. How do we onboard people quickly? How do we know who to hire? That is actually a huge amount of work that you think at first might increase your capacity. But if you don't do it well, or you're doing it for the first time, it will decrease your capacity for a while. And so for the past year, I'd say we've really been stewing and getting ready to grow even more looking forward. QReserve is at a really important inflection point in the company's growth because we've reached a point where we know we have product market fit and we are solving a lot of really interesting problems for a lot of different clients around the world. And at the same time, the market is growing as more and more people are expecting solutions like we offer. So, for example, when QReserve first started 10 years ago, our idea of having an online database of research equipment was brand new. People liked the idea, but there wasn't really necessarily good funding for it, or no one really knew which budget this fit under. And at the same time, people were doing a lot of processes manually, and they weren't expecting things to be automated. Fast forward 10 years, and this is becoming more and more expected. People are using AI to do their laundry. People are using all these different tools to automate things. You can call a car to your house with just a couple taps on your phone. And so as these people are moving into roles at, say, universities or large pharma companies, they expect that type of work to be automated too, especially when it's an obvious solution that computers can handle. And that's exactly what QReserve does. And so because over the past year, we've really been building these processes to run more efficiently, we are now targeting larger and larger enterprises. So for example, QReserve can work really well at small companies, but where we really start to shine is at large companies where they might be multinational. They have different facilities in Europe and the US and Canada. And you might have a worker in Canada who wants to figure out who could I work with in Europe, and having that information at their fingertips, being able to book it, being able to go through all the different credential requirements, have invoicing and finances work, and have everything connected is becoming not only important, but just flat out expected by the newer workforce. And so that is a really exciting opportunity for QReserve. And then working with, say, research institutions, like how we're working with St. Joe's through the Healthy program right now, they are becoming more and more receptive to knowing that computers can solve a lot of these tasks for people. And this is a solution that needs to be looked at. It's more efficient and it's less error prone. And so as a result, we see a huge opportunity for QReserve to continue to grow and to access more and more different types of clients around the world. Another really big change in QReserve has been just figuring out how to do what we're best at. And what recently happened is when I started QReserve, I was mostly by myself. I became CEO by default, right? It was my job to start the software development. I had to figure out the banking. I had to do the marketing, everything. A lot of entrepreneurs will go through this phase where they are just the CEO because there's no one else to do the CEO's role. But now, over 10 years, I've been working with my co-founder, Graham Brown, quite a bit, and he has really learned the business. And to be frank, he is far better at the business side of running QReserve. And I am far better at the technical side and the product side of QReserve. And so now we're at a point where we can start to figure out who should be doing what most efficiently. I don't have to do everything anymore. And that is an amazing experience, very freeing, and it also lets us be far more efficient. And it's not just Graham and I. We have 8 people on our team. We have some people who are amazing software developers. We have some people who are amazing working with clients, doing customer support. And everyone is focusing on exactly what they are good at. That makes us more efficient. And it also makes me enjoy my job as an entrepreneur a lot more because I get to spend all day doing exactly what I love and what I'm good at. And this is just a really neat opportunity and time for QReserve where we're going through this transitional phase. For anybody who's wanting to start a business, so they're currently an entrepreneur, there is some advice I always like to give people. And the first big piece of advice is don't be afraid to make mistakes. I'm sure I've heard a ton of the advice that I regularly give people early on, and I completely ignored it. But I think that's important because you're going to learn lessons as you go. And I think making mistakes are really important to understand why people say you should do certain things. One of the most important tasks you have as an entrepreneur is making decisions. Pretty much all day, I am making decisions. And they can be micro level. It can be, how should this feature be implemented in this certain code file? Or it could be super high level visionary. What are we doing in 5 years? What's our growth plan look like? These are all decisions. And I think it's very easy, especially early on, to get into the state of analysis paralysis, where you are trying to gather more and more information before you make the decision out of fear of making that wrong decision. But if you take too long to make a decision, that decision could become moot. And so I have really tried to focus on making decisions as soon as I think I have enough information that it's probably right. And it's not always going to be right, but as long as you're prepared to figure out what you do in that case, it's usually going to be better, in my experience, to move quicker than to always have the right decision. Also, a lot of the information you think you're making decisions on will be false. And a classic example of this is you might implement some feature or some functionality into your product that you think everyone's going to love. And you'll spend all your time implementing that, and you'll put it out there in front of people, and no one's going to care at all. And it turns out what people care about is the thing you didn't think 2 seconds about, but it turns out they wanted to know. And so seeing this happen day to day has gotten me to the point where I don't wait until I have 100% of information. I wait until I have, say, 70 or 75%, and then I try to make that decision. And overall, I'd rather go faster than have perfect information. Another piece of advice I always like to give is that being an entrepreneur will have very hard moments. There were times where we could not pay people, and we had to quickly go to friends and family, get a loan, deposit it, run payroll, and then hopefully we could pay it back the month later. Extremely stressful times. Or maybe we had a customer that was very mad at us because something completely broke and it ruined their week. Those are going to be very hard times as an entrepreneur, and you need to have the grit and determination to keep going. And in order to do that, you have to make sure you're working in a space that you love to work in. Because if you're working in a space just because you think you can get rich from it, or just because you saw an opportunity, but you don't really like working there, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to get through those hard times. And that's what really makes a successful entrepreneur. It's not just having the great times, it's working through the really hard times. Another piece of advice is that a lot of people out there want to help you. And being in the Hamilton area, working with Innovation Factory, being in Canada, there are a ton of programs and opportunities for people to help you. And it's often free. You don't have to pay them. But it's always important to figure out what is their motivation. So for example, maybe you can find a grant that can give you money to hire somebody. They're not giving that to you just because they're nice people. They want to see something in return. So for example, a grant, they want you to boost the Canadian economy. They want you to boost the number of jobs that you're employing. If you work with mentors, often they want to work with you because they want to help other companies succeed in their area and they want to be attached to those companies. And that's not a negative way, but I do think it's important to understand what is the motivation for somebody helping you, just so you can take their advice or their offerings in the right context. And the last big piece of advice that has been absolutely critical for QReserve is finding the right people to work with, because it is impossible to build a large successful business, at least like QReserve is, by yourself. And we have learned that having an absolutely amazing team is key to being a successful business. I have a lot of values in how we treat our customers, for example, and it's important that our employees have the same types of values. They have the same drive and determination and the same direction that I want the company to go in. You can't do it all on yourself, and you have to find people who excel at what they do and are happy at what they do. It's a huge motivating factor for me to think that I'm not just responsible for my family. I'm responsible for 8 families. I'm helping them make their income, pay their mortgage, pay their rent. And I want to make sure that everyone's happy and living a really great life working at QReserve. Because at the end of the day, it's not that we're just building some software, right? This is where people spend most of their lives. And so I want to make sure we're doing this all together and that everyone's happy. And that can be really hard. You have to make sure you have the right people and you have to make some tough decisions sometimes. But knowing that you're surrounded by really incredible, talented people is hugely important for your business. I think I speak for absolutely everybody who's involved with QReserve that we just see a massive opportunity to build a really incredible tech company right here in Hamilton. And we love meeting with like-minded individuals, whether or not you think you could use QReserve in your business or your facilities, or maybe you're just an entrepreneur who wants to talk about how you implement different controls, how you work on different customers. We love to have those types of meetings.
Thanks for tuning into the Growth Series. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and stay inspired. Until next time, keep innovating.